It wasn't until I basically finished editing that I realized I don't even think I recorded an intro. So here it is. The following video is basically 3 different book reviews that all kind of find cohesion in the question of modernity, particularly Ethiopian modernity. So I'll be looking at I had these prepared beforehand. So I'll be looking at Pioneers of Change in Ethiopia, the Reformist Intellectuals of the Early 20th Century by Bahru Zewde. A short, fairly short book, pretty academic, of course. It's a classic in Ethiopian intellectual history. I'll also be looking at Ethiopian theory, revolution and knowledge production, 1964 to 2016. This came out much later than this one, 2019, but also kind of intellectual history type of book, but also political history in a way. So definitely check this out. But it's also very theory based. So it's also like you're gonna hear me talk about it. Let me not overshoot my content. This is the second book. Third book, I actually don't have like a physical copy like this. I had to print it out. You know what? I'm gonna pull it up. Third book is What is Zemenawinet's Perspectives on Ethiopian Modernity. Now you can find this online, so this is why it looks like this. I don't have a binder nor the little 3-hole puncher, so I've been working with loose leaf papers as God intended it. So these are the 3 books that I'll be talking about, again, coalescing around the theme Ethiopian modernity. So check it out. Interesting, theoretically heavy books, especially this one. But this, I think, is a beautifully written book. I won't lie. I really did enjoy it on an even emotional level. So what will follow is my takes on that, and I will preface this by also saying, my audio is not too good. As you can see, I've had to demote myself to this because the little mic that I had, which actually got much better audio, is broken. I don't know why I broke it, but so towards the end of the video, particularly, not the best audio. So watch out for that. Anyway, enjoy. If modernization took its first breath through the midwifery of colonial rule, how does one apprehend its presence and vestiges in places where colonial rule never actually took root and hence could not have assisted its birth? This is really the primary question among many that historian of Ethiopia Bahru Zewde asks in his Pioneers of Change in Ethiopia, the Reformist Intellectuals of the Early 20th Century. Now, this is among the works in Ethiopian studies that really marks a promising shift in the discipline that sort of troubles the only country to have escaped, colonialism, European rule, epithet that's attached to it. Bahru's works since and prior have arguably challenged the unlikely independence seemingly sanctified with the Battle of Adwa. I know in this channel you guys have heard me sort of, look at the sort of connections of Ethiopian history and colonialism, re-engage with or re-look at just what kind of relationship Ethiopia has had with colonialism, right? Because again, when we talk about the only country to have escaped colonialism, Ethiopia is the one that comes to mind. But I think there's definitely interesting questions that comes up when we look at Ethiopia's relationship with Eritrea, when we look at Ethiopia's relationship with certain European powers who have done a lot to undermine sovereignty or Ethiopian sovereignty in the context of independence. What kind of independence are we talking about? And what kind of freeness from coloniality are we also talking about, or freeness from colonialism? In Pioneers, Bahru deals primarily in the realm of Western education, in the proliferation of modernist ideas and aspirations among those he argues wanted to reform the absolutist monarchy to a constitutional one. So it's people like ገብረ ሕይወት ባይከዳኝ, ሐኪም ወርቅነህ እሸቴ, ተክለ ሐዋርያት፣ ተክለ ሃይማኖት, like these people, and I'll try to include photos of them, but these are some of the ones that he talks about in this text that he kind of calls reformist intellectuals, right? And so with a focus on the educational backgrounds, intellectual production, and political and administrative aspirations of the 20th century, of the early 20th century intelligentsia of the Ethiopian Empire, Bahru argues that this sort of motley crew ushered in the dawn of Ethiopian modernity to make material what they felt was a sort of incompleteness of the Adwa victory, which is, I thought, interesting because, these modernist intellectuals were closer to Adwa. Like some of them might have actually lived through it or remembered it. It's not a distant history that they learned through a textbook. And so even then at the time they were sort of aware of the again, as what Bahru calls the incompleteness of Adwa victory, right? So there was a sort of existential crisis that, like, okay, this battle of Adwa was good, this is victory. We, lost Ertra, but Ethiopian independence, for whatever that looks like, is sanctified. But it's unfinished, right? And if anything, the colonists or the colonizers might come back even stronger. So there was a little bit of that. Rather than a sort of tedious series of biographical entries that mark the birth and death of his subjects, although some sections can read a little bit like that in this book, his innovative method to study these intellectuals as a group rather than individuals kind of allows him to consider, in some, their footprint on the development, progression, and even secularization of the imperial regime. In a word, modernization. So this is how I'm sort of deploying modernity in the Ethiopian context of, like, you know, we're sort of moving from traditionalism, moving from a highly, like, religious society and a highly agrarian society towards the sort of enlightened and more westernized sort of modern nation state, in the context of the 20th century. So obviously there's more to modernization, but this is really the themes at play here when we're talking about what ideas these intellectuals were kind of putting out. And of course, ever the Rankian historian, Bahru begins by carefully situating his query among key texts about modernization as well as geographically by comparing Ethiopia's modernity to that of Japan or China in the east, Russia in the north, and Egypt in North Africa. This comparative analysis sets the tone for the sort of overall method that's displayed in this history. So the subjects, philosophies, and biographical or educational circumstance of education is used as themes for comparison and contrast as well as categorization. So, you know, uh, one chapter is like, the first generation, and then that is subdivided by, okay, they went to, one group was Italian educated, another group was British educated, another group was French educated. So it served more as a categorization tool for him, and I'll talk a little bit about if there was analytical tool to separating them like this. But this is how he goes about organizing his intellectuals, his subjects. So after establishing the global context for Ethiopian modernity and the national context of modern education, Bahru uses his third and fourth chapters to discuss the first and second generation of intellectuals, right? And they're not just demarcated, not just by the time of their birth, as in, okay, these were people born in the 1800, like 18 late 1880s, and then early 20th century, but also in the sort of, in the second generation's case, how the Ethiopian government actually played an active role, an active campaign to actually send and fund these individuals abroad for schooling. So first generation, they were Western educated out of circumstance. Second generation actually benefited from government projects to send certain people abroad, right? So that also separated them. And so their innovative ideas and critiques in the realms of foreign relations, colonialism, history, and historiography, especially, that plays a big role in Bahru's intellectual history. Political economy, Amharic literature, and governance was the subject of the fourth and fifth chapters. And so he closes it off with a sort of appraisal of these intellectuals' social and political impact. And he offers that modernization was really an answer to the existential question that colonial domination posed, right? Because Adwa indeed was a shaky victory for Ethiopia. And if those that had so far rebuked foreign intrusion thus far wished to, quote unquote, survive as independent states, they had to modernize, right? So modernization was a question of, to an extent, of survivability, of actually, okay, we've rebuked colonialism to a certain extent. We need to now modernize to make that rebuking, actually give it some solidity, actually make it mean something. Because if they come back a second time and we're at this level of development, we're at this stage of disunity, it's not gonna work. That was the idea. So modernity was a sort of one answer. And this sort of doesn't deal with the fact that, okay, modernity in a lot of times means westernization, right? So are you westernizing because you see no other choice, to protect your identity, even though you're actively changing your identity by sort of modernizing and westernizing? And this is really like a sort of theme that you see come across a lot of African literature too. Like recently, this year, I read Batwala by Rene Mahan, which is a great classic African text, African, fictional text that came out in 1920s, I believe. And it goes through the same theme of, like, identity during colonialism, and modernization as well. And there's even a piece of, like, eco-criticism when it comes to the colonial impact, as well as Ambiguous Adventure, which originally came out in French. I think Batouala or so maybe came out originally in French, but Ambiguous Adventure by Amidou Khan also deals with this sort of internal transformation that happens amongst colonized intellectuals when they come into contact with Western education, Western philosophy, and how that sort of not only causes an existential crisis within and makes you question a lot of the traditions that you've learned and question the utility, and sort of a clashing of worlds sort of happens inside. It also forces the question of like, are colonized intellectuals, when they first come into contact with European culture and Western philosophy, like are they the ones that do willingly take it on, and the ones that willingly sort of transform their identity in that way, are they doing it out of a question of survivability? Because according to that book and Ambiguous Adventure, there's that struggle. So I think this is definitely a theme that comes across African literature, but then also throughout African history as well. Sorry about that tangent. Anyway, for Bahru, Ethiopian modernity finds its origins in the combined reformist efforts of a class of individuals who, either through fortuitous circumstance or proximity to and being of the nobility, had the opportunity to receive Western or indigenous education, or a mix of both, at home and abroad. Particularly mobilizing for those who went abroad was the juxtaposition of conditions in Ethiopia to what was the industrially advanced West, right? So, despite their sort of differentiated experiences, expertise, and their political leanings, the mission to modernize Ethiopia really united them first and foremost. And them being exposed to the West made them, realize, or made them aware of, okay, Ethiopia is backward, right? And so this unity, I think, ended up justifying their treatment as a cohesive group whose vision for Ethiopia modern was gradually implemented in the post-liberation years. So this is the sort of methodological intervention that Bahru Zewde makes, because up until the publishing of this book, which came out in 2001, I believe, 2002, came out in 2002, there have been studies that focus on the individuals as opposed to them as a group and what they represented as a social force. And so, this is a book-length study that looks at them in that way. So that's sort of what he's doing a little bit differently. But as valuable as intellectual histories are to understanding, quote, the mainsprings of political acts, events, and developments, as Meridwalda Aragai notes on Pioneer's blurb, in Globe back, um, you know what blurbs are, damn it. And that's I agree with that. But there are still concerns of intellectual history sort of top-down approach, right? Because when you're doing an intellectual history, you're looking at the history of ideas, and the ideas are usually communicated through some kind of text, whether that's writing, whether that's a speech, whether that's even arguably music, maybe, but some kind of word prose, right? So, do intellectual histories favor those who had the means and foresight to write down their ideas and pen pal with kings and queens? Though Pioneers does not answer this directly, in anticipation of this, Bahru's final chapter sort of lowers the abstraction by discussing what the material impacts of the elite class were, their role in promulgating a culture of political discourse, legislation, and political organizations. What Bahru calls a corporate identity are among ways the larger public sort of felt the impact of this group. However, women are not generally part of this group, right? Though there may not have been a sort of abundance of written items that women in, for example, Haile Selassie's court may have left behind, if at all, one can sort of wonder, reading this text, at creative ways that could have been employed to unearth some of their influences in the aim of modernization, especially in considering like the intrigues of Empress Taitu are mentioned, for example, but not necessarily an analysis of what her actions may have suggested about her impulses for Ethiopian modernity, if any existed. Granted, someone like Taitu, as empress, she may not have constituted a part of the subjects at hand, because these are intellectuals that sort of had a kind of like a rags to riches kind of story, right? But Empress Taitu, she's born into nobility. She may not even have had the same level of westernization these people have had, right? But Bahru's wide-ranging sources, from letters between the emperor and his ministers to essays, treatises, and Burhan Salam articles, allow for a more holistic approach to understanding the ideas and lives of these men of letters. Though the darker side of modernity is not the subject of concern, Bahru's honest reading reveals that reform does not always mean progress. For some, it meant assimilation and cultural homogenization, And this also sort of further demonstrates that though this elite was united through modernity, they were not one on method. Despite this, however, Bahru sort of categorizes subjects by using biographic similarities, like I mentioned earlier, how they came up on education, which Western country they went for school, and under whose patronage they came up. Though this is sort of useful in neatly grouping the scholars, it kind of raises the question whether there was analytical utility to this indexing. And by that, I mean, did which country they went for school have any impact on the kinds of ideas they ended up developing and so warranted distinguishing, or is it more for the sake of organization? This does, however, raise questions as to sort of alternative ways that the subjects could have been grouped. Would a thematic grouping that sort of distills their politics have been more useful? But so, for example, like, would sort of placing them on a political spectrum of, most leftist, most right, most conservative, most center, would that have been helpful, or is that even too much of a Western concept? I don't know. But I think this would all, of course, depend on the kinds of questions one is asking of these pioneers. Like, what are you trying to unearth, engaging with their writings and engaging with their biographies? And for pioneers, a work that's sort of the first of its kind, its task is to sort of provide a general survey and plant the seeds from which future research benefits. The kind that will sort of ask deeper questions about the pioneers' ideas over time, and sort of will need to reconsider, I think, how to categorize them, again, depending on the questions that you're asking. And as a preeminent historian, it's not surprising Bahru sort of spends a lot of time, especially in the sixth chapter, dealing with the subject ideas on history and historiography. But a literary scholar, or a political scientist, or even philosopher, however, may ask different questions and spend more time on their impact on language, or kine, that was briefly mentioned in Pioneers. The strength of any edited collection is perhaps its ability to bridge disciplinary and research gaps, provoke new ideas on a topic heretofore understudied, and present thematic unity in the diversity of its chapters and the disciplinary background of its authors. What is Zemenawinet? Perspectives on Ethiopian Modernity earns high marks in each criterion. Edited by the late great art historian Elizabeth Wolde Giorgis, this collection brings together historians, linguists, literary scholars, and scholars in architecture and urbanism to locate and give modern perspectives on Ethiopian modernity from their respective disciplines and fields. Organized around the question of what is Zemenawinet or modernity in the Ethiopian context, and in an attempt to impose analytical clarity on the ambivalence and plurality of modernity given the maze of contestation and opposition within Ethiopian modernist studies, as Elizabeth Giorgis so eloquently says, this collection steers the Ethiopian studies field to reconfigure how Zemenawinet, or modernity, has not only permeated a non-colonized society, but also how we can overcome, quote, the authoritative academic ontology, again quoting Elizabeth, with which the field has been occupied. Combating this predisposition of the discipline for this collection then means capturing, critiquing, and critically examining the ambivalence of Ethiopian modernity, the contradictions, what it actually means to be modernized, but also stick to your tradition. Is modernity inherently anti-tradition, and so forth, or is tradition anti-modernity? Though, as both Andres Zewde and Elizabeth Giorgis note, both of them, authors in this collection, apprehending the birthday or the start of modernity is sort of a tricky task. Its unlocatable dawn in Ethiopia has sort of raised questions about the way Ethiopia has, quote, entered the modern world, so to speak. This could mean locating alternative modernities, right, independent from the dominating Western iteration that nevertheless is in conversation with it. If we are to take our cues from the architecture and urban planning scholars, Elias Yusbarek and Fasil Giorgis, for example, Ethiopian modernity can mean utilizing what is socio-economically and culturally relevant to the masses as the building block for more humanitarian modernity in the realm of, for example, building a more equitable Addis Ababa in the wake of gentrification and forced removal. I think this is particularly poignant now and salient now because one of the, I feel like, reigning themes in the sort of among the Ethiopian diasporic community is this sort of theme that Addis Ababa has changed so much, our country has changed so much, like the streets that we once knew, the businesses that we once frequented, and the buildings we may have once even lived in are no longer there or have changed so drastically. And the frame of reference that we would even use to identify parts of the city that we once knew is just like gone, right? And so I think that definitely says a lot about modernity in our current context, how how the Ethiopian government today is chasing modernity, at the expense of the people, while at the same time saying that the modernity is sort of for the people. I feel like Addis Ababa is kind of turning into one of those state capitals that are like shrines to a regime, but don't actually have character, don't actually have the people that make it what it is there anymore. We kind of, I feel like, are seeing that process. It kind of reminds me of like, those YouTubers that go to different capitals, like in Uzbekistan, right? They'll go to Tashkent, or they'll go to, different places that have really authoritarian governments, and their capitals become, again, that shrine, that statue, that glorification of the regime, in which no one lives there. It's a ghost town, right? It looks pretty, but it's a ghost town, and I do have the sort of fear that that's where Addis Ababa is heading. But anyway, it could also mean coming to terms with the fact that modernity is not necessarily a forward march of progress, as Baye Imam demonstrates in his discussion of how African languages have been discounted through notions of their inability to communicate complex and discursive feelings. It could also mean apprehending the proliferation of sports, for example, as a means of self-improvement, especially in the African context, was a form of subject formation in Ethiopian modernity, as Katrin Bromber argues in her chapter in this text, right? So the book is again made up of different scholars, again looking at modernity through different perspectives and different sort of disciplinary questions. The Katrin Bromber chapter is definitely one of the ones that sticks out the most because she's looking at sports, she's looking at aesthetics, she's looking at the sort of industry and how that is also a marker of modernity, especially in a country like Ethiopia and a lot of countries like in East Africa, where the athletic body and the sort of national pride that comes with us winning gold and so forth. I mean, every country feels that, but in this respect, and in the respect of track, has a particular signifier of a national advancement or some sort of powerful image of modernity. And this is what perhaps unites the sort of interdisciplinary endeavor, that Ethiopian modernity, as it manifests itself differently in different contexts, is apprehended, is sort of understood briefly before it sort of slips our grasp again in all its sort of liquid discursiveness, in the interstices and ambivalences of the old and the new. Okay, I don't know why I wrote this. This seems so unnecessary the way I phrase it. Basically, I'm saying that like Ethiopian modernity in itself is a sort of complex, thing, right? Because again, even modernity itself is a complex thing, because a lot of people read modernity as westernization, right? And then the questions that I've been sort of dealing with is then, okay, are alternative modernities, or can a non-Western society become modern in its own way without it sort of refracting off of Western forms of modernization? Or because of colonization, is modernization inseparable from the sort of colonial capitalist system that we have inherited and are living under, right? So what is alternative modernities within that context? Is that even possible? Especially when you're looking at how during the rise of modern nation states, that in itself was a sort of reaction to colonial expansion in Africa, right? Like, I think one of the arguments that Bahru makes as well, or sort of tangential argument that he makes, is like modernization was a response to the existentialism brought on by colonialism. And so the modern nation state then that is attempted to become whole and attempted to be made a thing of is in a way a solidification of okay, now we're unified, we can actually protect our borders. But yeah, the idea is that it's not this like solid concept that you can kind of sort of grasp, because you can sort of argue, just based on the questions that I've raised now, is Ethiopian modernity necessarily a paradoxical sort of thing? Or even African modernity, you can sort of bring it up a level. So I was thinking about it, okay, is Ethiopian modernity best understood in the sort of spaces and ambivalences that exist between ideas and concepts and aesthetics of the old and the new, right? And the new largely being what is not of the indigenous, and the old that of what is. So I'm sort of putting the two, the old tradition, new, modern, sort of together to conceptualize this. And the ambivalence is captured in Andres Echete's chapter in this book, in which the traditional was strengthened through modernization, right? He says an absolutist crown, an established religion, an official language, and privileged public culture became constitutionally entrenched. So yeah, Haile Selassie's regime is a really good example to kind of use to understand what Andres Echete is saying here. One can successfully argue that Haile Selassie's regime marked the sort of consolidation of modernization, right? He built all these schools, he established newspapers in Addis, and he beautified the city, all these different things that Haile Selassie did as a sort of pioneer of modernization in this more like state-centered way. Although you can make an argument that modernization started earlier. You can maybe even make the argument that modernization started with Theodros, right? Like that, you can do that. But you can, at the very least, say, okay, a new chapter of modernization began with Haile Selassie. Interesting thing is, though, Haile Selassie's modernization was incumbent on, and still very much so, making sure that his absolutist monarchy was not just intact, but strengthened, right? So you kind of see a mix of the old and the new in this way. I think that's a good way to sort of think about that. However, as explained in the introduction of this text written by Elizabeth Wolde Giorgis and reinforced in her own essay in the collection, the critical intervention regarding Ethiopian modernity needs to consider what she says is the significance of power relations and the relationship of Ethiopia and the West as one that is often margin to center, far from being free of colonial influence or domination. So what at first seems like a willing march to Zemenawinet as westernization on the part of Haile Selassie's investments in Addis Ababa, or even the disciplines, again, authoritative academic ontology, you can even think of Gibbonism here, and the students' movement's midwifery of Marxian-inspired modernity, as Andreas Sachete argues, is rather a residue of a coloniality that's obscured by non-colonization. I think I might have mentioned this sort of idea too, right? Like this response to the threat of colonialism, this idea of Gibbonism, again, understanding Ethiopia through the perspective of the West, and the need, again, to modernize, or even in this Marxist sense, as a student movement had tried to do, is actually a residue of being colonized or being akin to colonized, right? That becomes hidden, that's harder to sort of see because the story of non-colonization is really what dominates the Ethiopian narrative. Yeah. I don't know how else to put it. I don't even know if that makes sense. But productive and path charting discussions that investigate this potentiality, however, are somewhat decelerated as certain contributions don't necessarily pick up the baton that's passed down by Andreas and Elizabeth. So, for example, Bahru also, contributes to this book, and his contribution offers really important insights into how Ethiopian historiography has unfolded by discussing those of the chroniclers, those that wrote about, the history of Ethiopia, but from the perspective of the, kings, the pioneers, and the sort of general trend towards scientism in the history field. So the main argument is that, like, okay, we made progress, we're being more scientific, we're being more, sort of accurate, although there's a critique to that. A lot of Ethiopian history is very much so state-centered, right? However, there's no clear distinction on either how Ethiopian modernity itself was debated in the historiography, for example, which kind of is what I expected from Bahru as a sort of preeminent historian on this collection called What is Zemenawinet, but maybe that's just me projecting what I expected, right? Not necessarily a weakness of the chapter, or what the evolution of the historiography itself, other than his own approval that it's a progressive trend, says about Ethiopian modernity. And what I mean by this is, like, okay, how has the march to scientism, as he argues, what does that say about modernity? What does that say about Ethiopian modernity? If we were to deal with Ethiopian modernity as a problem space in the historiography, it might yield interesting and generative questions that have arisen and then receded within the historiography that further lets you know that the evolution of how Ethiopian modernity was understood in a given historical position. So this is a little bit more of a meta exercise where if you're treating Ethiopian modernity as a problem space in the historiography, then you're looking at the questions asked in a given historical moment about Ethiopian modernity that then lets you know, okay, what were people thinking about when they thought about Ethiopian modernity at this given time? And the questions they asked lets us know what was important to them in that moment. And the questions that became relevant in that, or less relevant in that particular moment, lets us know, okay, this wasn't as important as that. And I think that also lends a lot of work to understanding historiography as well, and the sort of, shifting of it. Okay, again, I don't know if this is too meta. This is too meta, and I don't even know how you would go about doing something like that. But again, I thought that would be a more interesting historiographical exercise as well. And this could have also been, rectified with a more explicit dialogue with other contributors to the collection. There's hardly, if any, references among and between the contributions outside the introduction. So, like, you read Elizabeth Wolde-Giorgis' introduction, she tells you what this book is about, and the sort of different contributions the chapters then make. But among the chapters themselves, they kind of don't necessarily build up on each other's arguments, or they don't really refer to each other. And when you think of an edited collection, that's kind of what it's supposed to do as well. I mean, they don't always have to do that, but that's something you kind of expect, right? They're in conversation with each other, trying to answer the same question from different perspectives. And so I expected some of that, but there wasn't a lot of that. But this is not to again minimize the fact that this intervention really generates significant questions, even the one that I just mentioned, on Ethiopian subjectivity and coloniality in a sort of inter and transdisciplinary fashion that questions regarding modernity will necessarily require. However, there was an opportunity, and I don't mean to pick on Bahru, okay? There was an opportunity in which Bahru could have maybe engaged Andreas Tichete's article, especially in his argument about the midwifery of the student movement and the introduction of modernization, because Bahru argues that yeah, you can probably date this at a different time, but I would rather date the beginning of modernity with the pioneers of change. Andreas rather says no, it was really the student movement I think really marked beginning of Ethiopian modernity, and they use the exact phrase. They both use the term midwifery. And so I thought it would be interesting to see a sort of discussion or a debate among that, but there wasn't much of that. This is not to say that there's necessarily a disagreement either, especially since Andreas, although he argued the student movement was sort of the progenitor of modernization, he acknowledges that other claims to modernity exist, and those claims can be just as justified. However, I think again that there was room for discussion around how the evolution of professional historiography, right, history done by trained professional historians, also periodizes Ethiopian discourse itself. So on Ethiopian discourse on Ethiopian modernity. Similarly, Jonas Admasu's intellectual history of the early reformists and the Ethiopian student movement and their figurations of modernity, both as historical figures in their own right and scholars who critique historiography, could have created, I think, a symbiotic analysis with Bahru's contributions as well. So there was definitely, I think, opportunities to be just a bit more dialogical. But despite missing some of these opportunities, I think the heretofore unexplored intervention made by what is Zemenawinet should not really be overlooked in its ability to really critically engage Ethiopian modernity and its complex sort of iterations in a non-colonized state, while at the same time sort of planting seeds that future studies can sort of further disentangle. And I think the book, in terms of that, does really well, and I think that was its main goal anyway. So yeah, 10 out of 10 for me. What seems like an irresolvable tension plaguing insurgent thinkers who theorize liberation is a perennial problem of knowledge production itself. Is it enough to carry with oneself a healthy dose of ambivalence with every stride made toward progress, progress envisioned as a forward march toward a better destination, a destination made ever elusive because the way we even think about liberation itself is governed by forces against it? Elleni Centime Zeleke's Ethiopian Theory, Revolution, and Knowledge Production, 1964 to 2016, seeks to explore this question by telling the story of how to tell the story of revolution in the Third World. By using the writings and politics of the Ethiopian student movement as an entry point, Elleni not only tells the story of the lasting impact the movement had on Ethiopian politics during and after the 1974 revolution, but also a larger story about how colonized intellectuals engage with a field of knowledge not conducive to their liberation, and realizing this, sublimate it for their own purposes. This ambitious undertaking required Elleni herself to think through ways she can produce her writing by employing a method that attempts to evade the same epistemological trap that her subjects, the student movement, and the social scientists in Africa at large, had fallen into. So Tizita, akin to an embodied history, right? Tizita in Amharic means memory or to remember or, nostalgia, became her method of telling a story of revolution and knowledge production in Ethiopia. Part of engaging with the way the story of the revolution has been told brings the question why it was told in this particular way, and what about Tizita gets around its shortcomings. Elleni notes that at the heart of social science practice in Ethiopia is a positivist overinvestment in the meaning of concepts. Because the social sciences have been pushed to produce a direct benefit for society, rather than being understood as a space that opens up a critical and philosophical dialogue on social reality. So this positivist sort of obsession has become the main reason why we even do social sciences rather than to actually understand and do this sort of philosophical dialogue on reality, as she says, this investment in we do the social sciences for this purpose or for that purpose kind of makes impotent the potentials of what you can actually do with social sciences and really understanding your social reality and actually changing it for the better, um, because you're so obsessed with a specific goal, right? Hence, in an attempt to move away from the instrumentalization of a given story for particular ends, what she calls a usable past, Elleni's use of Tzita allows her to move away from parochial empiricism and positivism, right? Because it allows her to capture this discursive element of the Ethiopian revolution or of social life in transition. So Elleni approaches the study with the notion that the telos, right, of the student movement and revolution sort of remain an open question, not a foregone conclusion. So by using Tzita, Elleni both demonstrates a way to do history that escapes positivism, while also showing how the very subjects that she studied were also grappling with the limitations of the social sciences to which they themselves had access to. And they were sort of theorizing their way out of, okay, how do we how do we move beyond this monarchical system? How do we better our conditions, right? Telling a better story of the pseudo movement for Elleni also meant dealing with the fact that, quote, the questions and answers posed by the pseudo movement are hardly ever linked to longer social, political, or economic trajectories that have framed Ethiopian, African, or even global history, and neither the pseudo movement nor the revolution is analyzed in terms of policy impacts or continuities with other African or third world countries. So, after providing a profound account of her own relationship to revolutionary Ethiopia with political discussions that her parents were having, in exile at the dinner table, for example, in the first chapter, Elleni deals with establishing continuities with Ethiopia in chapters 3 and 4 by showing how the ideas of the student movement and the men behind those ideas played protagonists, which were the main character roles during the 2005 election and the political processes in 2016 and beyond. So she's really making this continuity sort of point at the very least, within Ethiopia itself, and making that really looking at the impact of the student movement and how, in a lot of ways, the '05 election and the politics of Ethiopia 2016 and beyond have been an after history of the student movement in a lot of ways. And so tracking the continuities and problems of the student movement to the rest of Africa, however, was dealt with in the second and sixth chapters, where she conjoins, quote, the different historical practices related to knowledge production within the Ethiopian student movement with ongoing debates on knowledge production in Africa. So critical to bridging this was using Partha Chatterjee's framework of the thematic and problematic of nationalist thought, and I thought this was just fascinating concept to think through how insurgent thinkers, colonized intellectuals have had to, have had a problem of knowledge itself, particularly as subjects of a colonial state or subjects of a nation state, so this framework allowed Elleni to show how the student movement, much like other anti-colonial nationalism in Africa, was taking the thematic, right, the sort of epistemological base that was deposited by colonial and capitalist expansion in Africa, was taken for granted, right? This too is the always already present problem of social sciences in Africa. The biggest victory of Ethiopian theory is not only a move away from what Zewde has identified as the historiographical tendency to either celebrate or castigate when writing about the pseudo movement. Remember, I think I cited that particular quote in one of my videos, but also the way she puts her intellectual history to work in, quote, opening up the present, right? So Ethiopian theory is both a work of really serious history and memoir that is given a physicality and body through Elleni's sort of multidisciplinary approach in thinking through our relationship with the past. So Elleni collaborates actually with the artist Lulu Chernet to show the way that Addis Ababa has transformed while carrying with it, quote, sediments of an older modernity, earlier formations of Addis Ababa architecture that are buried under a new, more up-to-date version of what the modern ought to connote. This then becomes a really valuable tool to visualize how the sediments, right, of the student movement finds itself embedded in physically and discursively in Addis and its politics. So Ethiopian theory makes a really strong argument for just how large of a footprint the student movement has left on the nationalist and state-building projects of the regime, including and succeeding the Derg. So asking whether the students were good or bad Marxists or social scientists, as the historiography has tended to do, is not really a productive endeavor that helps us find this alternative method for practicing the social sciences in Ethiopia, because I think in this book, Elleni really uses her book, as both as a case study, but also as a case study to make a larger argument about the social sciences in Africa, and the social science and the problem of social science in Africa is kind of the same problem that colonized intellectuals had to deal with in terms of, again, this epistemological base, right? I think it's just the sort of positivism that we see as a symptom, as a trademark of coloniality, of colonialism, and the sort of, in this epistemological front. And so she uses the student movement again as an entry point to make a larger argument about why we're doing the social sciences the way that we are, and how we can sort of transcend that with the current system we find ourselves under. And so I think Elleni's methodological breakthrough with Zewde is one that scholars can adopt in future research if we agree with the premise that positivism, empiricism, and usable history have been sort of unproductive ways to study Africa, a way of knowing Africa outside of itself. As Elleni notes, moving away from this is also thinking through how our present is, quote, pregnant with alternative pasts and futures. So coupling Zewde, for example, with the Undam interpretation from the Kane tradition, then to become the potential way of doing the kind of history that Elleni calls for and demonstrates, because, in the Kane tradition, when you're doing the, Undam interpretation, no single interpretation is made more valid than the other. And I'll quote Mamre Menasima from Kane hermeneutics, who argues that Undam produces differing, if novel interpretations, where each interpretation strikes out in a new direction and opens a new horizon of meaning, thus excluding counting it linearly with others, right? So this form of interpretation opens up new horizons of meaning after each iteration of Undam that is made aware of its own incompleteness, read to as a sort of a longing and absence that's embodied in the Zewde methodology, right? Because, I'm only going to do such a scratching of the surface type of analysis of Elleni's book because, I think it's so theoretically deep. Because she sets up her book in a way that I've never really come across before, where she is inserting herself in this history, that the fact that she feels this longing to know and to understand the sort of obscureness that she's experiencing as she's trying to apprehend the revolution and its afterlives and the student movement and so forth, and that is itself part of the methodology, right? The longing, the absence is part of the story of the revolution, and I think it's just interesting in the way that she inserts herself and then embodies it, because she's also, again, while she's critiquing this positivism, this empiricism, this ability to do history the right way, or history to do it in this scientifically approved way, is such a fever dream. When you contend with, when you have an honest contention with the knowledge base within which you are operating in, right? The questions that you're even able to ask become limited because of that knowledge base. So your ability to be empirical a lot of the times can be in collusion with forces that are telling stories or telling narratives against your interests, or they may not be true to your experiences as a colonized person, as a colonized people. So for a historiography dominated by a center/periphery axis or a state-oriented narrative, Undam presents an opportunity. As Elleni's use of Zewde shows, this would not simply be an amalgamation of indigenous subjective knowledge for the sake of counteracting colonial ones, right? So I'm not just saying, okay, yep, Zewde, now we do Undam, and then now we do this, and now we do that because they're so Ethiopian sounding or they're so indigenous sounding, right? Rather, I think it's an alternative to current, quote, to current forms of knowledge production that constitute horizons of political action, especially the kinds of questions that we ask in the social science. So again, going back to how do we try to transcend the guardrails put upon us that we're not even aware of, because that's all we know, sort of thing, right? It's kind of similar to what Trio was talking about in Silencing the Past, about how, the revolution in Haiti was sort of this unthinkable event, right? Then that we couldn't even, that people at the time, historians, respected historians of the West at the time, couldn't conceptualize as a revolution, that Haiti's revolution was even a sort of contested thing, right? So that's one example of sort of how we mean when we're thinking about history and the knowledge available to us and the kind of questions we ask because of what's available to us, right? So yeah, ultimately, utopian theory does not give a simple answer to the questions posed at the start of this review, nor does it necessarily intend to. But I do think it charts new paths toward more capacious histories, presents, and futures. that of course new scholars, emerging scholars can then benefit from. I feel like every book review just sort of ends with, this book does that, this book does this. Um, it lacks in that, it lacks in this, but it does this, that, then more research can be done. And like, I feel like all book reviewers ultimately sort of come, you know, are confronted with the perennial problem of you can't cover everything in a finite thing. Anyway, I wanted to review these books, well, partly because they were a class assignment. Secondly, I think the texts that I looked at are very foundational and important books to know, to be aware of when thinking about the history of Ethiopia, but also thinking about the historiography of Ethiopia, basically, right? The way history has been written, and what questions historians have asked, what arguments have been made about Ethiopia's past. Like that in itself becomes a knowledge base for for us understanding what we know, why we know what we know, and how we know what we know about our particular past. And I think this is a little bit of a timeless question, especially when you're an African. I think themes of tradition and modernity, themes of colonization and resistance, and themes of longing and the sort of usurped past or disrupted past. I feel like that those are really important themes in African history that unites a lot of us. Anyway, stop that. I'll stop here. Yeah, so yeah, check me out on the next one.